Okay, welcome everyone. I think we're going to get this rolling. On behalf of the college, Anoka Ramsey Community College and our Cambridge campus and our English department here on campus, we welcome you and thank you for coming. My name is Bill Breen. I'm a member of the English faculty here on campus, and we're particularly excited this year because this is our 30th year of doing our Minnesota Writers Series. And part of that, celebrating that milestone, is that we're having two events this year. So just make a mental note that this spring on March 24th, which is a Saturday, we will have Kelly Barnhill as a guest writer. Kelly is the author of, among other books, The Girl Who Drank the Moon, which won the Newbery Prize this year, which is the highest honor for children's and young adult literature in all the land. So it's a pretty special event, so just keep that in mind if that's something that you're interested in. What amazes me as someone who helps coordinate this every year is what a rich pool of writers we have to draw from in the state of Minnesota. We're pretty fortunate in that regard, and today's guest writer is a great example of that. I also want to say some quick thanks to all the English faculty who helped and the support staff who helped, our people in facilities who helped set up, and IT for getting us mics and a camera, for Jessica in the bookstore as she made an announcement as some of you were coming in. There are books for sale outside, and our guest writer will be signing books and saying hello to you after the event. There are also some refreshments that are being set up right now. So if time allows, feel free to hang out and take advantage of this opportunity. Just a quick reminder that if you would please silence your phones and please not record any video of the event. We are recording the event on behalf of the college, and that will be available for you as a student to view later if you'd like. I just want to acknowledge that there are some students who do need to leave early, and we absolutely appreciate that you're trying to do more than one thing during this time. I know there's an environmental science class that's going out to test the water at 12:30, and so we made some compromises to allow you to do that. We appreciate that you're trying to do more than one thing this afternoon. Just ask that you, if you do need to leave, obviously just try to do it quietly and without any disruption, and we'll all be good. We are switching up our format as opposed to just having the author at the podium. We're doing this interview style, and Kelly Myers is going to interview our guest writer. Kelly Myers, English faculty here, and a personal friend and former classmate of our guest writer. Kelly was the one who said, "I've got this friend, and we got to get her in here because she's blowing up." And it's absolutely true. So let me introduce our guest writer. Leslie Nekarima is a graduate of Mankato State University's MFA program in creative writing. She's a resident of St. Louis Park, right? She was born in the UK and raised partly in Nigeria. She's teaching a class at the University of Minnesota and is serving as a mentor for the Loft Literary Center's Mentor Series. Her first collection of short stories, What It Means When a Man Falls from the Sky, published in April by Riverhead and reviewed widely, has received great praise across the country. Stories in her book have been published in The New Yorker, Harper's, and elsewhere. In June, her story Glory won an O. Henry Award. In September, her book was shortlisted for the Brooklyn Public Library Literary Prize, which will be announced in just a couple weeks. Last week, she was shortlisted for the Kirkus Prize, which will also be announced in the next week or two. And most recently, the book has been, the author herself has been named one of the 5 under 35 fiction writers to be honored by the National Book Foundation, a national award. I would also just add that she seems to be recently one of the hardest working writers in the Twin Cities. She's at the U, she's at the Loft, she's at Century College, she's in parking lot at the book festival, and she's everywhere. She's keeping busy, and we're excited that this is one of her stops along the way. Please welcome Leslie Nika Arima.
That was a really lovely introduction, Bill. Thank you.
All right, so I'm really excited to do this interview format to get to have a little conversation with Leslie, especially featuring a lot of questions from students who have read and discussed Leslie's stories in your classes. So I'm just going to kind of sample some of those questions. And first question is kind of acknowledging what Bill mentioned, which is that you're out and about doing a lot of work now talking about your writing. And so I'm curious as to how that expectation that you be able to talk about your writing has developed along with your writing, if that's been, kind of challenging, or talk a little bit about that.
Yes, so, writing is a very solo activity. You and your computer and or notebook doing your thing. And so what has been interesting since the book came out and, having to do interviews and talk about my writing is sort of having to reframe how I talk about writing in a way that I'm not typically used to. I have to now think about how I craft things. I have to now be able to articulate what it is that I'm trying to pull off of the story, and so it adds interesting dimension of the way I understand and interact with my work, and it's just been like quite the change to have to navigate that. Yeah.
Good. So, what about having a public persona? Now you're like in the public eye, and how does that feel to you? Does that mean anything particular to you?
Yeah. So, I mean, I have a Twitter account, and I was on Twitter, like long before this book was a twinkle in the milkman's eye. I've been, and one thing that's been interesting. So when I had a public persona, but it wasn't tied to my work in any way. It was just me being myself in public. And so what's been interesting is that one of the things that I promised myself when I started my Twitter account was that I'm just going to sort of be myself, uncensored, and say whatever it is that comes to mind. And so now it's interesting having that persona being filtered through my work. So most people who now encounter me in public are people who have read my work. And so it's interesting to sort of now have to think, do I start censoring myself now? Am I now, it seems so strange to think of myself as a public figure when I'm just me. And so that has been like an interesting development. Yeah.
That's a nice segue into the next question, which is, I know the answer to, because our student journalist, Ashley Johnson, asked you this, but how has the publication of your book most changed your life?
It hasn't. I mean, it has in that I do more events like this, and it's sort of changed where I fit into the larger literary world. But like my day-to-day life is still the same. I still have to take out my trash. I still have to do my laundry. I still have to sit down at a computer and like write things, and so my day-to-day life hasn't really changed much. Yeah.
So what about the fact that you're garnering all this attention and receiving so many accolades for your work? Has that changed the way that you write? Do you feel a new sense of confidence or pressure to perform, to live up to that?
I sort of dealt with the pressure to perform period right after my the story came out in the New Yorker. And so after that, I sort of, when I sat down to write, I thought, oh, this story that I'm writing has to top. It has to top like the New Yorker story. And so that, so it was a couple of months where I sort of struggled with that, but it's, I have a very short attention span, and so I was quickly able to sort of move on from that and just, get back to my normal writing life.
And so something else that I've noticed with a lot of writers is the tendency to not set the interpretation of their work in stone, to kind of leave it very open to the reader to make their contribution. So, you know, I'm not expecting you to say this is what this story means, but what about, I mean, have you ever encountered a take on one of your stories that really surprised you, or maybe that you even disagree with whether or not you would actually say that?
Right. I have, and this happened, and this is something that happened a long time ago. Somebody wrote a review of a story that I had written, and this was before the book actually came out, and their reading of it was so antithetical to what I thought the story was, which sort of helped to reinforce the idea that once you write something, let it out in the world, you have no control over how people interpret or interact with the work. At that point, once you've written a thing and said it out in the world, your job as a writer is done, and you can't control the way people understand your story. They bring themselves to the page, and there's nothing you can do about that.
Is this okay now?
Just keep it up.
Like all the
Once you
time?
put it down, then it starts to get feedback.
Okay.
Thanks.
We didn't make it the time to do the mic check, and I'm super inexperienced with microphones, so. Okay, so I'm excited about this. We wanted to ask if you would read a little bit of one of your favorite stories from the collection, and talk a little bit about your writing process for that story.
Okay, so I'm going to read a portion of Who Will Greet You at Home, and this is a story that so it takes place in an alternate universe where instead of giving birth to children, young women make their children out of materials, either found materials or materials that they're able to afford. And the protagonist of our story decides to make a child out of hair, which is forbidden. And so I'm just going to read a portion of the story. There was an old tale about hair children. Long ago, girls would collect their sheddings every day until they had a bundle large enough to spin a child. One day, a storm blew through the town, and every bundle was swept from its hiding place into the middle of the market, where the hairs became entangled and knotted together. The young women tried desperately to separate their own hairs from the others. The elder mothers were amused at the girls' histrionics, how they argued over the silkiest patches and the longest strands. They settled the commotion in thus. Every girl would draw out one strand from every bundle until they all had an equal share. Some grumbled, some rejoiced, but all complied, and each went home with an identical roll. When the time came for the babies to be blessed, all the girls came forward, each bundle arriving at the required thickness at the same time. There was an enormous celebration of this once-in-an-age event, and tearful mothers blessed their tearful daughters' children's life. Next morning, all the new mothers were gone, some with no sign, others reduced to piles of bones stripped clean, others bones not so clean, but that was just an old tale. So this particular story was one of my earliest forays into writing magical realism, or alternative universe speculative fiction, however you might define and categorize that. And I wanted to, I really enjoy what speculative fiction can do, which is that you can take something in our world and essentially turn the volume up on it, because you have now removed it from the context of our modern society and placed it into this unfamiliar world. And so what happens to our conventions when they are not cushioned and insulated by the way that we normally do things? And so in this particular case, the story sort of dealt with this particular young woman's desire for a child. And so within the context of this new universe, that desire and the lengths that she goes to now becomes grotesque. And I really sort of enjoy doing that, sort of revealing the potential grotesqueness of things that we consider normal.
Well, I did have a follow-up question about magic realism, so maybe I'll just ask now because you already kind of touched on how you would define it and what the appeal is for you. Do you have any writers that have kind of inspired you in that genre?
I mean, I feel like there are a lot of standards. Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude is sort of a book that I consider like part of my literary ancestry. I really enjoy his work. I enjoy Toni Morrison, her works of, people think of her as a speculative fiction writer, but a lot of her works have an element of the surreal. And for me, what I enjoy about those two particular writers is how naturally the surreal is treated in the story, and it's not a thing that people necessarily wonder at. It's just part of the world around them, and I think that the best speculative fiction is executed that way, where the surreal seems as real as everything else.
My next question is, do you have any rules for your writing, or generally what you see as some of the markers or kind of things that you can follow as a writer, and again, for yourself or just generally?
I don't, and the only reason I don't have rules is that, or even like rituals for writing, is that I worry that about getting too caught up in needing to have things a particular way in order to get the work done, right? So if I have all these rules, then what happens with, my favorite pen or my favorite spot is not available, right? And so so I don't have any particular rules or rituals. My rule is like whatever gets it done, and however that works for me or for you, and whatever gets the work done.
Very good. So what about the role that you see Minnesota as a state having played in your development as a writer and your work itself?
So when I graduated from my writing program, I did research on, so I knew that I wanted to be a writer and I was serious about it, and so I had to figure out where's the best place that I can move to in order to make this writing thing happen. And so, over my course of my research, the obvious places came up, and New York was the top one. But the thing with New York is like really expensive and also like overcrowded in terms of like trying to be an artist. Like it's almost a cliche at this point. And surprisingly, one of the cities that came up was the Twin Cities, or Minnesota as a state, which I somehow had not encountered during my time as a student. But this is it's a state that takes its arts funding very seriously, and so whatever your genre of art is, whether you're a dancer or a visual artist or a musician or in theater, there are resources in order to become, to help you become, to move on to the next step, whatever that next step may be. And so I sort of stuck around Minnesota to take advantage of those resources, and it worked out.
Yay, Minnesota. So when did you start seeing yourself as a writer, and maybe talking about the first thing you wrote that made you feel like it was something you were good at and you wanted to do more of?
I was always more of a really intense reader than I was somebody who thought of myself as a writer. I had an experience as an undergrad where I took, I had decided that I was going to go to law school, but I majored in English because it was just something that I was interested in, and I was always interested in books. And I took a writing workshop my last semester as an undergrad student, and my professor, Juliana Baggett, and this was at Florida State at the time, she sort of introduced the concept of becoming a writer. I don't think I really understood that you could actually study to become a writer. I read a lot of books constantly, but I just kind of thought it just kind of happened. I never really gave a thought to who wrote those books, and didn't even know that you could go get a master's in creative writing, and so that in addition to sort of having the, her sharing with us work that was inspiring and interesting, also just like the practical knowledge that this is a thing that people study, and it is a thing that you can study to become, or a career that you can actively choose to pursue, and that just sort of blew my mind. I was like, I didn't realize, at that point I had known that you could just decide I want to be a writer, and I do that.
Yeah, absolutely. When do you know when a story is finished? And do you ever look back and revisit a published piece and have certain thoughts on it?
That's a hard question for knowing when a story is finished. A lot of my stories, I start off with an idea of how I want the story to end. And sometimes I get to that end and I'm satisfied, and other times I get to that end and like something is still missing, and so I keep writing ahead. There's a story in the collection, Bucci's Girls, for example, where the story ended several pages before the final version initially, when I first drafted the story, and I mean, spoiler alert, there's a pet chicken that dies, and the story ended pretty close to after the pet chicken died, and it just gave too much weight to the death of the chicken, which was not, I mean, the story was not obviously not about a chicken, and so, and just conceptually, having that death so close to the end gave it weight and importance, and so I kept pushing the story beyond that, and that changed the context of the death and sort of recalibrated the story so that it just, like, it was done until it was done. Yeah.
Kelly, sorry to interrupt. We're having trouble with the lapel mic, so could we just turn that off, and could you just pass it back and forth? Sorry about the sound troubles, but I think that'll help a lot. Thank you.
So, next question. At this time of heated political debate, a lot of writers and artists are using their work to weigh in. Is that something that you feel compelled to do? And what relationship between art and politics makes sense to you?
So I'm currently working on a story that, as part of an anthology that is sort of directly interacting with this current political moment, but I don't typically write about politics. I mean, politics comes up in my work as I'm writing about people who are existing in the world, and as a person who exists in the world, you encounter, situations that are, quote unquote, political. But I feel, as a Black writer and as like a Black woman writer in America, it's Black writers, and I'm not American per se, but like Black writers and writers from marginalized communities in the United States have always been writing in a somewhat tense political atmosphere. And so I mean, the volume is obviously turned up now, but it's not necessarily a change. It's just the intensity of it is ratcheted up. I'm more interested to see how white writers actually respond to this political moment. It's really interesting. We talk about how dystopic fiction, right? We had a rash of really popular novels that took place in dystopias, and that, if you can sort of trace the line, that sort of came out of the economic climate being what it was around 3 or 4 years before those books came out, because that's usually how long it takes to write and then have a book come out. And so you see these patterns in publishing that sort of respond to what the social climate or economic climate of the time is. And so I would be really interested to see what American, white American writers are writing, what comes out of this time. Because marginalized writers have always written in these tense environments.
Another good segue. So talk about writing characters that are different from you in fundamental ways, different gender, race, etc. What are the joys and what are the challenges of that?
I don't typically, I mean, most of my characters, at least with this short story collection, are women who are from Nigeria or like some version of Nigeria when I'm writing speculative fiction. And I mean, there's just so much to explore there that I'm not quite yet at the point where I mean, I don't know, like it's not a thing that I think of, like, it's not a thing that I think of as something that I want to eventually do. It's just, I mean, this is my world, and it's so like it's so rich, and there's so much to write about. I sometimes write from different gender, perspective of different gender, and you know, a man from Nigeria, for example, or a man in these fictional Nigerias, and that is always interesting to me in terms of whenever you write from a perspective that's not yours, you have to have there has to be like a radical empathy. You have to quite literally be able to put yourself in that person's shoes and understand the ways that they see the world and understand the ways that they interact with the world, which is challenging, which is more challenging the more different they are from you and the more different their experiences are from yours. And so you know, so I try to do that. I try to be, you know, radically empathetic. One of the things that that has sort of required me to do that is writing a different class than myself. I grew up middle class, and I sometimes write about characters from the perspective of characters who are not, and that has been a particular recalibration of thinking about the things that I take for granted that my character might not, and the things that my character might struggle with that I might not, and that has been an exercise in empathy.
Taking a sharp left turn here, what other career might you have, or if you'd prefer to think about hobbies that feed your writing, or maybe just give you another creative outlet?
I recently started sewing, and I sew only jumpsuits, and just I'm so tall that if I want a jumpsuit, I'm gonna have to make it myself, and so like that has been really interesting in terms of just doing like a creative thing that's not writing. It's always really fun. I also like to take pottery classes, and it fulfills the same sort of, you know, desire to create something that doesn't necessarily have the pressures and expectations that I bring to writing. As for other careers, I mean, you know, I feel like there's so much that I can like. I mean, like when I say so much, like I could be an admin anywhere, right? Like I can file, I can do that. But I probably would, if I had to make an ideal career, it would probably be, I don't know, a personal trainer or like a dancer. Something like that. You know, and I don't actually know how to dance, but I would, like, if I had the ability, just the idea, just, you know, again, creating something that's interesting and potentially beautiful, but it's not necessarily just sitting and typing.
Yeah. So what contemporary writers are you reading, and what, if any, new ideas or themes or writers in the writing world excite you?
So I'm really excited theme-wise. I'll get to the writers, but I'm really excited that there's been a recent rise in people writing quote-unquote climate fiction, and so it's really interesting. Again, right, seeing what works are coming out of our, you know, just, you know, the situation in the world, right? And so it's been really interesting to see people write about that, and sort of, you know, the idea that people are really, it's something that's really engaging our literary imagination. And so now people are actually thinking about, you know, what does this type of dystopia look like, or what do I imagine the Earth to be like 50, 100, 200 years from now. I find that really interesting in terms of just what, like just the fact that people are thinking about that, right? And like, that we're now imagining this thing. As for contemporary writers that I'm excited about, I'm the same. I'll try to stick within like maybe the last 10 or so years. I'm really excited about Carmen Maria Machado. She has a short story collection called Her Body and Other Parties, which just came out, and it's a really lovely, lovely work. There is a novel called An Unkindness of Ghosts, which is an amazing title, by a writer called Rivers Solomon, which is also like an amazing writer name. She just really lucked out. It's a novel that's sort of like, so humanity is like living on a ship, like the last of humanity is living on a ship, and like it's just really interesting. And let me try to throw in one more. I'm also really excited about. Let's see. There's a novel that I read, and it's probably one of the best novels I read in the last 5 years. It's Kintu, and it's Kintu by a Ugandan writer called Jennifer Makumbi. And she has just sort of like blended historical fiction with an element of magical realism and this generational saga. And it's a book that took her, I once heard her speak, it took her 10 years to write, and it's like you can see every one of those 10 years because it's such an intricate and smart and clever book. And yeah, so those would be my authors.
Along the same lines, have you ever met a writer or other figure you admire and been a little bit awestruck?
I try not to. I have. I mean, I'm not going to name any names. I have met writers that I greatly admire, and it's always really nice when they're down to earth. Oh, I will name a name because he just won the Man Booker. I once met George Saunders. Well, I met him a couple of times at different events, but he was at Minnesota State University for the Good Thunder reading series, and as part of that, like he regularly interacts with, over the course of the day, the MFA students in the writing program, and he was quite literally the nicest person I have ever met. I'm actually disgusted that anyone can be that nice. I didn't think it was possible, and so like really eliminated my own personal feelings. But he was like a really, really lovely person as well. In addition to being a fantastic writer, obviously he just won the Man Booker for his novel, and so that was really sort of gratifying to meet somebody whose work you admire, who's also like a genuinely nice person.
So this next section are all student questions. I worked in some of the recurring insights that students have about your stories into the other questions, but these are all student questions. So these are kind of some related questions. What is the toughest task facing writers today? What is the #1 struggle in your writing? Another related question that I liked is what is the most annoying thing about being a writer? So if you want to speak to any of those.
Well, I can say that the toughest thing for me, and I think also probably for a lot of writers, I'm assuming, I don't know, but there's an element of discipline that's involved in being a writer and being somebody who like completes a work. And so when I was working my short story collection, my process was, I could go for, like what happens, like I will have an idea for a short story, and then I will let it brew in my head for a very long time. And that brewing process, like, I'm thinking about the story, I'm thinking about the characters, I'm thinking about the plot, I'm thinking about some language things, and so the story brews in my head for a very long time, sometimes for a matter of weeks or maybe even months. And then when I sit down to write, I've thought about the work for so long that when I sit down to write, it comes out pretty quickly. And so this is, some of my short stories happen that way. Others happen sort of more traditionally with daily writing bit by bit. But a lot of them happen that way. And so conceptualizing a short story is a lot easier than conceptualizing an entire novel. And so the process of I'm also working on a novel, and so the process of novel writing has been sort of like having to relearn a different kind of discipline, because you can't write a novel in, well, you can, but it's going to be excruciating, a novel in like just like bursts of, oh, I'm going to do 5,000 words today, and it's just not sustainable in the way that it was for me with short stories. And so, because you can do that with a short story and have a one-day burst and be done, you're not going to have a burst with a novel and be done. You can have a burst and have a chapter, right? And so like I've had to like relearn a different type of discipline. That's probably been really challenging. The other question was about what I found annoying. Most annoying about being a writer. I mean, I don't know. It's not very annoying. I get annoyed when I get annoyed at myself mostly when I haven't written in a while, or just like the fact that I'm somebody who likes to procrastinate, because I feel like, oh, I do my best work under pressure, and so I'll wait and then start, and like that annoys me, because it's just like I could have had this done months ago, but I decided to wait until like the week it was due. Yeah.
And again, perfect segue. How often do you write?
That's a really good question. So, like I said, when I was writing short stories, it was more this brewing, and then a burst of like this flurry of activity where I put a draft down. I try and this has had to change with the novel. So I'm not quite at the daily writing, but like I'm working up to that, because I think that's what I'm going to have to do in order to actually get this novel done. And I've done a couple of rewrites of this particular novel, but I did it in the same way I did short stories, where I worked in like these like really, really intense bursts of activity. But like that, but after like a really intense burst, I'm like burnt out and I don't write for a while, and then it's another really intense burst. So again, I've had to like relearn this sort of like slow, disciplined process, and so I do several times a week, and I'm working up to like every single day do something so that it doesn't become like this, it doesn't like become this huge thing that's lurking over my shoulder that I need to get done. Yeah.
And a lot of students wanted to hear about your writing process, and you've already said a fair amount about that, so maybe I'll tweak the question a little bit and ask, what are some of your main approaches to revision work, and how big of a role do you see that playing in your writing process overall?
So revision, that's something that's been very different in terms of for the short stories and for my novels. So with short stories, because I do the brewing for a while, typically the first draft is not perfect, obviously, but it doesn't require like really intense sort of like revision overhaul, as opposed to my novel, where I will scrap 50,000 words and just start over, and that's something that has that's something that I never thought I'd do, because I thought, I've done all this work, I'm not going to just like toss this aside. But I mean, there comes a point where you have to like balance the amount of work you're willing to do, and then like the book that you want, and realize that, okay, you're gonna have to do a lot more work than you thought to get the book that you want. So with my process for the novel and for short stories is different. With my novel, I'm more likely to start something over, or recently one of my revisions required I changed who the main character of the novel was, because the novel clearly belonged to someone else, and I was finally able to see that. And so I feel like it seems almost like counterintuitive, but the more work that I put into creating something, the more willing I am to just like scrap it and start over.
Ruthless if necessary. So some students are wondering, what is the best thing a prospective writer can do to prepare for a career in writing?
Okay. I mean, there's the craft stuff, which is to read, and you of course, I'm sure you've all heard this, but I mean, I really just want to emphasize that the idea that if you are somebody who wishes to write, you should also be somebody who is reading and reading pretty voraciously. The idea that, I mean, if you're a writer who doesn't read, it's kind of insane. Like, why you, if you don't think that reading is important, then why are you even writing in the first place? But also not just to read, but to read widely and read a variety of genres, even ones that are very different from the one that you are writing. And the reason it's important to do that is when you read work that's very different from yours, you are, or even like very different from the work that you, from reading that you from works that you typically read, you are now sort of adding to your subconscious this new or different way of storytelling that you may not have encountered with the genres that you typically read. And so the wider across genres that you read, the more ways that you now have, or the more ways that you now know to tell a story, the more ways, the more tools you have in your writer toolkit, because you just know that there are all these different ways that a story can be told. And so I find it really important to not just read, but read widely. More practically, to get a career as a writer is to get a job, and a job that's not in writing. And the reason I say that is you want, especially when you're just starting out, you don't want your income and living tied to this baby work, right? The idea being that you don't want, if you depend on your writing right away to make your living for you, you are now putting such a burden on this artistic process that it's going to warp your relationship to the work. It's going to warp the way you approach writing, period. If you're approaching it as how can I get rent by doing this? And so what getting another job that doesn't have anything to do with your art does, it gives you the freedom to be as indulgent and experimental with your artistic endeavor as much as you want, or as much as the story might need. And it just gives you a certain amount of freedom to be able to do that, because you haven't tied your income to this thing. And so I mean, later in your writing trajectory, you might get to a point where your writing is now earning a living for you, but don't put so much of a burden on that in the initial stages.
Is there any significance in the arrangement and order of the stories in the book?
Yes. When I initially was in charge of thinking up an arrangement, I decided to do. Least fantastic to most fantastic, and fantastic in fantasy, not fantastic. Which was a really lazy way to. I mean, I just couldn't think about any other way to order the stories. But my editor had the better idea of instead sort of pairing stories thematically, and so basically, so she kind of figured out that, this story kind of goes with this one, and the goes might be something really, it may be something really small, or something larger. It could be one of the things that paired the story together, for example, was mother-daughter relationship, and so that that kind of a pair. The first two stories were paired together. There is sort of an echoing of the Biafra War in each of those stories. So just she had a much better idea of how to pair the stories, and so it's there was some thought that went into that.
And that leads well into asking a couple questions about specific stories that students were wondering about. Why did you decide to leave your audience in a cliffhanger at the end of Glory?
Did I? No, I mean, so the thing, I once took a writing class where the workshop leader said, that quote unquote surprise endings only work, or abrupt endings only work if the reader can make an educated guess as to what happens next. And so I did not do that with Glory, but there are enough clues in the story that that sort of make that I believe there are enough clues in the story that make what happens next pretty clear. So, yeah.
They just want you to say, I'm sure. And then questions also about Windfalls. What was your inspiration for that, and why did you choose to write it in second person?
That particular story was oh, it's been so long. It actually came out of a writing assignment where we were given a line, and I think it might have been a line from Shakespeare, or perhaps one of the a British poet that would have been maybe his contemporary 100 years later. Anyway, we were given a line, and that mean like whatever that line was, I can't even remember what the line was. Like whatever that line was has since, it's nowhere in the story really. But we were, initially I wrote the story around this line, whatever that line was, being dialogue in the story, and that inspired the story. But again, like I said, it's been so long, and I can't even really remember what that line was. And so, but it eventually became the story, and this, of course, this particular, the published version of the story was different from what the assignment was, but it was that's part of the story's ancestry. And what was the other part of the question?
Second person.
Oh, why was the second person? So I played around with different points of view actually. So I wrote it in second person initially because it was it just sort of felt right. So the introduction of the story was largely the same, and so no, it wasn't. Sorry, the introduction of the story actually went through quite a bit of revising, but it started off with the paragraph where she talks about supermarkets, right? And so while I was constructing that particular paragraph, it just naturally became a you as opposed to a her or an I or a me, and so I just let the story sort of flow and let that happen. I did at one point change it to first person, and it kind of worked, but didn't quite, and so switched it back to you, refined other things, and eventually got it to work.
I'm gonna go ahead and make this the last question, which I think is a good one to end on. This is a student question. What is your favorite thing that you have written?
I feel like it's like asking me to pick a favorite child, which I will do. Probably the favorite short story of mine is Second Chances. And Second Chances because it was a story that I did not realize I had in me to write, and so it wasn't one of those stories where I sort of had the idea that germinated for a while. It was a story that happened from conception to execution pretty quickly, like in the matter of a day. Obviously not the final version, but like the first draft of it. And so that was like a really like a lovely, pleasant surprise. I'm gonna pick one more too, if you don't mind. The final story in the collection, Redemption, that's also one of my favorites because I started writing that story when I didn't know what I was doing in terms of like writing. I was still in the learning stages, and I sort of had this epiphany early on where I realized, I don't know what I'm doing. I I know storytelling. I know, like I thought I knew storytelling, but I went out and read this really wonderful story, Somebody's Baby by Diane Cook is one of my favorite writers, and I realized, and when I read that story, I was like, oh, I didn't realize you could do that with a story, and so I just realized just how long, how far I had to go in terms of like being a writer who could, sort of narrow the space between the story I picture in my head and how it happens on the page, right? And so like you always want to get that space closer and closer until you're able to write the story that you're thinking about. And so I started writing that story when I wasn't really sure what I was doing, and it stayed in a drawer for a very long time, and then revisited it after I had narrowed that gap between story in my head and story in the page, and it was just a wonderful experience to be able to see what I had done, to see what I needed to do to fix it. It was just like a very satisfying experience. Thank you so much.